Hello again, rebooters, and welcome back to another episode of Love People Use Things. You, fine sirs and ladies, are watching this on my YouTube channel, which is all fine and good. If you'd rather just listen or download the audio, then go over to lovepeopleusethings.fm. You can hear it there, as well as past episodes by me and my co-host, Matt Frad. Today we're going to be discussing 4 ways in which pornography use can permanently impact and alter our brains. So without further ado, let's get this started. Howdy, and welcome back to Love People Use Things. My name is Noah Church, and I co-host this podcast with my dear friend, Matt Frad. Now, Matt is an ardent and committed Catholic. I am not religious, so naturally we don't see eye to eye on a lot of subjects. But we both agree that life can be so much richer and more satisfying, more connected, and more virtuous when free from the influence of pornography. And for those of you new to Love People Use Things, that's what this podcast is all about. It's about porn's influence on us as individuals, as developing sexual beings, as romantic beings, and as a society that's currently inundated with adult, quote-unquote, material due to the nature of the internet. Anyone in a developed nation with access to internet or a computer has easy access to an unlimited amount and variety of pornographic content. And it would be irresponsible of us not to discuss the impacts that this can have on us and on our children. So that's what we do here at this podcast. If you missed last week's episode, it was from Matt, and I highly recommend going back and listening to it. It was about masturbation itself, apart from the use of pornography. Now, I'll be the first to admit I'm not as much of a hardliner on the use of porn-free masturbation. I think that one can masturbate porn-free and still have a healthy, satisfying life and great relationships, a great marriage, or romantic relationship. It can become disordered in certain people, absolutely. But in others, I'm not yet convinced that it's an overt harm. But it is a very valuable subject to discuss, and I think Matt brings up a lot of really good points in his episode. So I encourage you to go back and listen to that before or after you listen to this one. Today, I'm going to be discussing 4 ways in which using pornography can permanently alter and change our brains, and some of the consequences of those changes. I think that knowledge is power, and the more that we know about not only porn, but what it can do to us and what's going on in our bodies, our minds, our spirits, especially when we become compulsive users of porn or any other substance or behavior, and it starts to negatively impact our lives, and we feel like we're losing control. Gaining this knowledge of what's actually happening within our brains can be very invaluable for regaining control, understanding ourselves, and reclaiming our lives and our daily experience. So I want to start with just a definition of addiction. This definition is taken from the American Society of Addiction Medicine. And what it says is that addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. A dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and/or relief by substance use and other behaviors. Addiction is characterized by inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, craving, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and interpersonal relationships, and a dysfunctional emotional response. Like other chronic diseases, addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. So what the American Society of Addiction Medicine is saying here is that addiction itself is its own disorder. No matter what the object of that addiction is, whether it's a substance like alcohol or nicotine or cocaine, or an activity, a behavior like watching internet pornography, or gambling away your life savings, or even over-exercising. All of these activities can become disorders, and when it becomes compulsive and a significant amount of negative impact builds up in one's life, and that person commits to quitting or tries to quit but finds it very difficult or impossible to do so, that's when we can start to recognize the effects of addiction. And addiction, no matter what the object of that addiction, can be seen in the brain. We can actually see changes in people's brains that reflect these changes in their experience of life, in their emotions, and their spiritual differences, their cravings. We can see physical changes and chemical changes in their brains that correspond with these more qualitative changes in their life. Now, how does all this work? What's the basis? What's the fundamental fact about ourselves that allows a non-addict to become an addict? That is called neuroplasticity. What neuroplasticity means is simply that our brains, our neurons, our brains are made up of millions and billions of neurons or nerve cells, are able to change throughout our lives. They're plastic, they're moldable. Now, before a few decades ago, scientists believed that one's brain grew and developed throughout childhood, but once one reached adulthood, it basically became static throughout the rest of their lives. That could not be further from the truth. What we now know is that the brain continues to change and grow and sometimes devolve throughout our lives if we misuse or neglect certain parts of our brain. For example, a study demonstrated that if you teach a certain group of people to learn to juggle, and they practice it daily, the areas of their brain that correspond with motor function and with visual acuity actually grow and strengthen, and we can see this on brain scans. The same people, if they stop practicing juggling, their brains will go back to their previous size. But the wiring that allowed them to learn those skills that they developed through learning those skills and practicing those skills on a daily basis is still there and could be reactivated more easily in the future than it would be to learn it for the first time. Our brains are able to do this so that we can learn and change throughout our lives depending on the needs presented to us in our lives. If we have someone who learns several languages, a polyglot, for example, the part of their brain responsible for linguistic function will actually be stronger and larger than the part of the brain responsible for those functions in someone who only speaks one language. So the brain does this so that we can learn, so that we can adapt, and we can change throughout our lives to best suit the needs presented to us. But it can also result in addiction when we engage in activities that are overstimulating or superstimulating or unnatural, and we engage in these activities chronically and compulsively. Dr. Norman Doidge was one of the first people to write about neuroplasticity and its relationship to addiction in his book, The Brain That Changes Itself. What he said, in a small part of this, is that pornography, delivered by high-speed internet connections, satisfies every one of the prerequisites for neuroplastic change, forming new neural circuitry, a key element of addiction. The addictiveness of internet pornography is not a metaphor, he says. Not all addictions are to drugs or alcohol. People can be seriously addicted to gambling, even to running. All addicts show a loss of control of the activity, compulsively seek it out despite negative consequences, develop tolerance so that they need higher and higher levels of stimulation for satisfaction, and experience withdrawal if they can't consummate the addictive act. All addiction involves long-term, sometimes lifelong, neuroplastic change in the brain. For addicts, moderation is impossible, and they must avoid the substance or activity completely if they are to avoid addictive behaviors. So what we can learn here is that our experience of life, our cravings, our senses, is all moderated and mediated through the physical structure of our brain. Now, even if you believe in the existence of a spirit or a soul that exists apart from our physical bodies, it's easy to see that indeed our spiritual experience of life is mediated by the state of our brains. To test this out, just imbibe a few glasses of alcohol, and you'll soon realize that indeed by introducing this physical and chemical substance into our bodies and our brains, our perception of reality starts to change. We might get dizzy, we might feel a different way, you might feel euphoric, and you probably will start to make decisions that you wouldn't otherwise make, especially if you have more than a few glasses of alcohol. Also consider acute brain damage. Now, in the mid-19th century, one of the most famous medical cases in medical history occurred to a man named Phineas Gage. He was a construction worker or railway worker or something. I don't have the information in front of me, but I'm working off memory here. Anyway, he was involved in an accident in which an iron rod was driven through his skull and destroyed much of the frontal lobe of his brain. Miraculously, he survived this and he made a full physical recovery, but the mental changes exhibited in him after the accident were significant. Now, prior to this time, he was considered responsible and respectable. His employers thought well of him, as did his employees, and he was a good worker. He was a functioning member of society. But afterwards, people noticed very significant differences in how he behaved. He was quick to anger, he was quick to engage in bouts of filthy profanity, he was an excess drinker and gambler. It seemed like he had lost much of his ability to control his more animal impulses. Now we know that this part of our brain, the frontal lobes, and specifically the prefrontal cortex, is largely responsible for what makes humans human and sets us apart from much of the rest of the animal kingdom. It involves and is responsible for our ability to predict consequences, to plan, to reflect on the past and think about the future, predict what might happen in the future, and control the impulses that we feel, but that we know we shouldn't act on in order to protect ourselves or those around us from our destructive urges. But Phineas Gage found himself no longer able to do this because of that brain damage that he experienced. But a message of hope, later in life, he had experienced very significant improvement in all these complaints. Probably because, and we didn't have fMRIs back then, but I'm guessing it was because his brain was able to adapt and reform and change and repurpose other parts of his brain to compensate for what he had lost during that accident. And we can see that happen today in other medical cases. So, we've established that the brain can change throughout our lives, and that it changes depending on what we introduce to it, whether that's a substance or an acute physical injury or a repeated behavior. So what are the 4 brain changes that I want to talk about today? These are all related to addiction, and all have been demonstrated to occur in compulsive porn users. Number 1 is called sensitization, and it means becoming conditioned to desire X, whatever X might be. Sensitization is a process of training the brain to respond to stimuli with desire. Now, imagine or remember a time when you encountered a new food. You looked at it, it looked weird, it didn't look necessarily appetizing, it maybe looked curious, maybe made you interested to try it, but you didn't feel at that very first sight of this new dish a strong desire or hunger, I'm guessing, unless you were just really hungry that day. But after you tried it and you realized, oh wow, this tastes really good, and you had it that time, you had it a few more times, over time you are training and conditioning yourself to recognize that stimulus as something that leads to a reward, a good taste and nourishment. So when you see it, after a few times of having that dish and really liking it, then you have an immediate desire to eat it. You might start salivating, you might feel hunger pangs in your stomach, and you'll have a more immediate emotional reaction to the sight of that dish, that food. This is a process of sensitization, and it's a natural, healthy process. It helps us learn from the time that we're born until well into adulthood and death what in life is going to provide us with the rewards that we're seeking, whether those are more basic rewards like nourishment or sleep or companionship, or other rewards such as feeling the adulation of your peers or having spiritual fulfillment. Anything that we feel as a reward, we can become sensitized and conditioned to. Where this can become a problem, especially, is when we introduce substances or stimuli that are overstimulating, that are superstimulating, that are more stimulating than the brains of our ancestors would have encountered. Now, of course, I'm talking about internet porn specifically. A modern man or woman can go online today and see more images of attractive mates engaging in more variety of sex acts than his or her ancestors would have seen in a lifetime. In just one afternoon, you can have 20 tabs open in a web browser, all playing compilation videos. You can switch from tab to tab, and keep that arousal going with constant novelty, constant new experiences, new visual delights. This is something that our rational brains knows is not real. We know that it's just a computer screen. We know that there's not real attractive people who want us on the other side of this screen or in our real life. But that primal part of us, that part of our brains that is responsible for processing these stimuli at a very basic and fundamental level, that part of our brains does not know the difference. That part of the brain is common to many of the other animals in the animal kingdom. It's a much more basic and older part of our brains, and it's responsible for giving us that experience of desire when we see that fat slice of chocolate cake or that attractive woman who walks into your fourth period. But when we train that part of our brains to become aroused by internet porn, we're exposing it to much, much more sexual stimulation than we would ever encounter in the natural world. And that can be very addictive. It can be very powerful to experience those images, especially as a young boy or girl whose sexuality is just developing, whose brains are at the peak of plasticity, who are most open to new experiences and training to new rewards. At that time in life, we're most vulnerable to developing compulsive behaviors and addictions that later turn into lifelong problems that we must then deal with as adults. So sensitization, I'm not going to go into too specific of scientific details. I'm trying to keep things more general. One, because I'm not a neuroscientist, and two, because if I got too detailed, we would be here for a lot longer than you probably want to be. But at its most basic, dopamine is largely what drives sensitization. And dopamine is a neurochemical. It's like a neurological messenger that is sent within our brain. Dopamine, when released and absorbed by dopamine receptors within the reward center of the brain, is what communicates that there is something that we want out there in the world that we are looking at or smelling or feeling right now. And that's what qualitatively gives us that feeling of desire. Sensitization and conditioning to those rewards happens when we have frequent or regular exposure to that dopamine in response to the same stimuli. So when you see that same dish 3 or 4 or 10 times, and every time you get a reward, you get the taste that you like and you get that nourishment, over time you're trained to respond to it, you're sensitized to it. This is why substances like nicotine hook a lot more people than harder substances or more extreme substances like cocaine. Cocaine, while it provokes a higher spike of dopamine in the brain of those who use cocaine, people who use it tend to use it more occasionally, and fewer of them get hooked. But nicotine users, tobacco smokers, often engage in the activity multiple times per day, and that repetition of exposure, that repeated training, is actually more effective at sensitizing one to that stimuli and training them to become reliant on it than occasional higher doses of dopamine. So with pornography, one becomes sensitized to a computer screen, sensitized to a screen that flashes lights and shows images of other people having sex, of other people engaging in sexual activity. It lacks so many of the other sensory experiences that exist when you're actually in a room alone with someone you're attracted to and you're about to make love or be intimate with that person. There's no looking in someone's eyes and seeing a soul there. There's no touch of skin against skin. There's no hearing her laugh. There's no emotional interplay. There's nothing like that. And so when one becomes sensitized to pornography, the stimuli that they experience when they then go to a real intimate encounter can feel alien. And it might not activate that feeling of desire the way that pornography does, especially when one is exposed to pornography and becomes a compulsive user before ever having an intimate sexual experience. If you heard my last episode, you know that that's what happened to me, and that's what has happened to many other men who have developed porn-induced erectile dysfunction. If you missed that episode, I highly recommend you go back and listen to it. So now we understand sensitization. And when one becomes sensitized to anything, it can become very hard to ignore that feeling of desire, because that feeling of desire grows stronger the more we are trained that it leads to a reward, like orgasm. We actually see this in the brain scans of compulsive porn users. A research study at Cambridge University showed the brains of people exposed to pornographic images. And if you look at the comparison between the brain of someone who is not a compulsive porn user, who is looking at porn, and that of someone who is a compulsive porn user who's looking at porn, you'll see a very noticeable difference. Now, the brain of that person who is not a compulsive porn user will be lit up. It will be responding to what that person is seeing because pornography is stimulating. And we are all sexual beings. That is a fundamental part of who we are and a fundamental biological desire. So everyone responds to pornography, but the brain of a person who is a compulsive porn user will light up much, much more strongly, indicating a more qualitative experience of much more powerful desire that's harder to ignore, harder to turn down. All right, the second brain change is, ironically, desensitization, which means that one becomes numb due to overstimulation. So we talked about how porn and other substances like cocaine, nicotine, high-stakes gambling are all super stimulating. They're more stimulating than much of what we would encounter regularly in the natural world. Now, this amount of stimulation is going to overstimulate the parts of our brain that are processing it. Now, imagine you're a construction worker or someone else who works with their hands. Over time, you develop calluses. At the beginning, when you first start swinging the sledgehammer, you might develop blisters, your hands might bleed, but over time, your skin thickens and becomes tougher. This is because our bodies, just like our brains, are able to adapt to what we engage in on a daily basis. Our bodies are smart like that, and it can be very useful in a lot of aspects of life. But in addiction, what happens in the brain is our reward circuits, that part of our brain that processes stimuli and translates it into a qualitative experience of desire, becomes desensitized. It becomes numb. It shuts down because it's being overloaded. If someone is shouting in your ears for minutes or hours at a time, eventually you're going to get sick of it and you're going to cover your ears. And the same basic thing happens in our brains. Now, this results in what we call tolerance. So imagine an alcoholic who starts off drinking 1 or 2 beers and feeling really good, feeling that high, that buzz, but then down the line, they grow more tolerant to alcohol, and they need more of it or stronger alcohol to feel those same feelings. In pornography, this often manifests in escalation in the types of porn that the user is seeking out. So for example, I myself started on images of pretty ladies. That's all I was really interested in. Harder stuff or more extreme or graphic stuff sort of was off-putting to me at the beginning. But as I was desensitized and my tolerance rose, I found that I needed to escalate to more extreme images in order to feel those same aroused feelings. Now, desensitization doesn't just affect one's experience of their chosen behavior or substance. It tends to affect everything in their life because that structure, that part of our brain, is responsible for processing all the stimuli that we see. So we become desensitized to everything. Desensitized to the pleasure of friendship, to romantic connection, to the joy of completing tasks or completing homework. Anything like that just becomes less interesting and less exciting. And the only thing able to break through that gray, numb experience of life is, in fact, what we are most sensitized to, is the experience of our addictive behavior. Now you can start to see why people get hooked and find it so hard to quit, whether it's porn or alcohol or any other thing that they are addicted to. That's the only thing that makes them feel alive anymore because, in fact, the process of engaging in that behavior desensitized them to everything else. The third brain change is called hypofrontality, and it means basically that we lose self-control and objectivity. Remember Phineas Gage, who experienced brain damage to his frontal lobe and was then unable to control himself or think rationally about the consequences of his actions? Well, on a smaller, less extreme scale, the same thing happens in addicts. We actually see a weakened connection between the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that's rational and logical and responsible, the part of our brain that's responsible for putting the brakes on those desires that we know are self-destructive or irresponsible. That part of our brain and its connection to the part of ourselves that feels that primal desire is weakened. And we become less able to apply the brakes, less able to foresee consequences, to think rationally about our behavior, and to interrupt that cycle of our desires arising and then acting on those desires. So if you've ever been frustrated with an addict, thinking, why do they keep breaking promises to me or to themselves? Why do they seem so out of control? Are they just a weak person? Well, that's hypofrontality in action. And it can be debilitating. It can make you feel like a weak person. It can make you feel very confused. Why am I consistently acting against my own best interest? Why am I breaking promises to myself? I swore to myself I wouldn't do this anymore, but every time I make that promise, I break it. What's going on? Well, that is hypofrontality. And lastly, we have a dysfunctional stress response, or dysfunctional stress circuits in the brain. And simply put, this means that a lot more than just seeing the object of our addiction, seeing a pile of cocaine or seeing a triggering image on the internet, can start to make us feel temptations to use. Other emotional experiences can start to make us feel urges. Experiences such as stress, anxiety, loneliness, depression can all lead to cravings to engage in that behavior. Everything starts to become a trigger for use. Because what has made us feel better in the past? What's made us feel like we could just forget about our problems for a while and feel good? Well, engaging in our addiction was able to do that, at least for the moment, even if it left us feeling worse afterwards. And so that becomes our response to stress or anxiety or other negative emotional states. Instead of feeling stress and getting pumped up and aroused to deal with the actual problems in our lives, instead we turn away from the problems in our lives and medicate that stress by engaging in our addiction. Those are the 4 major brain changes that are experienced by all addicts. Now, addicts demonstrate these brain changes, but many of these brain changes can arise in an individual who might not qualify as an addict. So it's like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. All addicts can exhibit these brain changes, but someone who uses a lot of pornography and has developed sensitization, desensitization, even hypofrontality, and dysfunctional stress responses might not actually be addicted in terms of the definition of addiction that we gave earlier. Meaning that if they recognize that porn is bad for them and they want to quit, and they're able to do it without too much problem, then they're probably not an addict, but they might still have experienced all these brain changes. Are you depressed yet? I don't mean to depress you or bum you out. You may have noticed in the title that I'm talking about permanent brain changes, that I use the word permanent. But that doesn't mean that you can't recover, that you can't recover from addiction, that you can't live a porn-free life, not plagued by urges all the time, sensitive once more to the real pleasures in life, to open to the connections that you can make with other people, romantically and otherwise. You can live an absolutely phenomenal life. Even if you've been addicted to porn for years or decades, you can recover, and your brain can recover as well. However, these changes are permanent in that they are set in your brain, and even if they become neglected and weakened as you leave porn behind and rewire your brain to find pleasure and reward in real satisfying experiences in the world with other people, even then, that wiring still will exist in your brain. It's as if a road is constructed and well used for years, but then it gets neglected, the asphalt cracks, weeds grow up through it, eventually the forest takes over again and you can hardly notice that there was a road there at all. But if they choose to build that road again, the land is already cleared, the embankments are already leveled, and it's much easier to construct that road a second time, clear away the weeds, repave, than it would have been to build it the first time. Now, I'm not a road builder. I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe it's harder because you'd have to remove the old asphalt. But the metaphor stands. It's much easier for an addict who has recovered to slip back into old habits and reactivate those patterns and pathways in his brain and go back to his bad, self-destructive habits that he tried so hard to get rid of than it is for someone who had never been addicted to get addicted in the first place. That said, there is a lot of strength to be found in this journey of recovery, this journey of reclaiming your life, committing to be porn-free, and building yourself back up again. You can be stronger than you were before and more empowered because you have new knowledge. You can watch out for the addictions in life. You can recognize patterns that you have experienced with pornography or other substances or behaviors and preempt the addictive cycle if it ever comes up again in your life. Maybe if you had never gotten addicted to porn, then you would have fallen into the trap of using heroin instead, and you'd be dead before age 30. Maybe this was meant to happen, and you're a stronger, better person now because of this journey of recovering from porn addiction. That is how I like to think of it, and I hope that's how you will think of it as well. Thank you for being here with me today, for listening to this. I hope that it was educational for you. I hope that you understand addicts a little bit better. Maybe you understand yourself or a loved one better. If this series of podcasts adds value to your life, if it helps you, or you think it's important to be discussing these issues, then we could use your support. If you don't know it, Patreon is a website that we are a part of. It's a website and a platform that allows viewers and consumers of content like you to support the creators that they think are doing good work in this world. You can pledge to support us as little as $1 a month, but if you support us at higher, $2 a month or $10 a month, we'll have rewards for you. A lot of free stuff that comes along with your pledge of support that is actually quite valuable. It's a $50 value for what you would get if you support us at $10 a month right away. Here's what we'll send you in return. We're going to send you a signed copy of Matt Fradd's book, The Porn Myth, Exposing the Reality Behind the Fantasy of Pornography. We're going to send you another book called Equipped, Smart Parenting in a Sexualized World by Amanda Zerfas. We're going to send you a month of Covenant Eyes for free. You'll get access to Covenant Eyes for a month for free, which is the premier internet filtering and accountability software available. We're going to send you a 3x3 Love People Use Things sticker and a free Love People Use Things t-shirt. That is much better than what it was before, which was 25% off a Love People Use Things tee. That alone makes it well worth the pledge price of $10 a month. I'm wearing one right now. It's really comfortable, it looks great, and it proclaims to the world that you value people, you love people, and you use things. If you're watching this podcast on my YouTube channel, I'm going to show the camera right now. Looks great. It's very fashionable. If you're listening on lovepeopleuseThings.fm or iTunes or whatever it may be, you can go over to my YouTube channel, Noah BE Church, and see the shirt there. And we will also allow you to access free live stream events, number one for men, number two for women, for both men and women, and finally for parents. To support us, you can just go to lovepeopleuseThings.fm and click support. We would greatly appreciate it. It will allow us to keep making this content, keep spreading this message, grow, and hopefully combat the harms that internet pornography has been spreading across the world without much resistance until just the last few years, when people who have recognized the harms of porn in their own lives have come out to speak and break the silence, break the taboo of speaking about something that has been kept quiet for far too long. We need to have these conversations. We need to address these problems, and we need to do better. We need to teach our children to handle this type of content responsibly, to make the choices that will actually result in the happiest and most satisfying life and most virtuous life that they can live. Thank you again for being here with me, and for any of our current patrons, we appreciate your support from the bottom of our hearts. Matt Fradd and I love making these, and we'd like to continue doing so. Finally, for anyone out there who's looking for more personal guidance, I am a recovery coach. Any issue you have related to pornography, pornography addiction, or pornography-induced sexual dysfunction, you'd like to talk to somebody about it, you can find me at addictedtointernetporn.com. All right, everybody, I hope you're back next week for another episode from Matt Fradd, and you'll hear from me in 2 weeks. Have a wonderful porn-free day, everybody. Bye for now.